Let's consider the case of Kevin Strickland, a Missouri man who was exonerated after being wrongfully incarcerated for 43 years, but is ineligible to be compensated by the state of Missouri due to certain laws. This man is classified as Negro, black, colored, and African American. He was charged with the triple homicide that took place in his area back in 1978. The title of this episode is The New Dred Scott. So, the reason why it's called The New Dred Scott, a play on the term The New Jim Crow, which is the title of a book written by Michelle Alexander. Speaking about the prison system, there is a parallel between this man here who is from Missouri, and was locked up in Missouri, and the situation with Dred Scott. Now, there's a parallel because the 13th Amendment states that involuntary servitude is prohibited except when found guilty of a crime. This is the case that happened with this man here, Kevin Strickland, who was wrongfully convicted, and incarcerated for 43 years. He was placed under involuntary servitude because when you're in the prison system, you're working for the state. They call you state property. They have you working for practically free, pennies. So, you might as well call it free. So that's slavery. Make no mistake about it. It is slavery. If you think that's not true, watch the Netflix documentary entitled The 13th. That's if it's still on Netflix. If it's not, then you should be able to watch it on some other platforms. That particular documentary lets you know exactly what that is. Also, watch the documentary entitled Broken on All Sides, which has Michelle Alexander speaking there as well. You can go to YouTube and watch her lectures. She goes into great detail about the prison system, as it relates to people who are classified as Negro, black, colored, and African American today. So, when we look into the Dred Scott case, exactly what was that? This has been mentioned many, many times before. I'll mention it again because it needs to be mentioned again. It's not spoken about enough. The Dred Scott decision is not spoken about enough. People like to pass it off like it's not in effect. It has never been repealed. Ever. Do not be mistaken. Do not be fooled. When people try to tell you that the Dred Scott decision was repealed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, it was not. All you have to do is just look at society today. That's prime evidence. That's clear evidence that it was not. The situation with Kevin Strickland is proof of it. So, in the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision in 1857, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the descendants of Africans who were Negroes of the African race who were imported into the United States and sold as slaves were not included nor intended to be included under the word citizen in the Constitution, whether emancipated or not, and remain without rights or privileges, except such as those which the government might grant them. So, in layman's terms, this means the descendants of Africans were deemed to be chattel property. Now let's briefly examine a few excerpts from the opinion of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. Now, this must be said to get the point across because nationality is the order of the day. The same Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who ruled against Dred Scott, ruled in favor of the inhabitants of Africa who took over the La Amistad ship from the famous Amistad movie. Those men who caused the mutiny on the ship, took over the ship because they were captured. They were kidnapped to be enslaved, but they fought back while on a Spanish ship. That case became a Supreme Court case. On the question of whether those individuals from Africa were indeed slaves and property or were they not, it was ruled in favor of those inhabitants of Africa. It was ruled that they were indeed free men and women because they belonged to the family of nations. The term family of nations is used in that Supreme Court case. So, it means that they had a nationality. Now, let's examine what Chief Justice Taney said in the Dred Scott case. Also, we're going to examine an excerpt from Justice Daniels as well in his concurrent opinion. So Chief Justice Cheney said, quote, the question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country, and so, the slaves, become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such, become entitled to rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen? It will be observed that the plea applies to that class of persons only whose ancestors were Negroes of the African race. End quote. Furthermore, Justice Cheney said that these classes of persons were not constituent members of this sovereignty, and that they were not included, are not included, and were not intended to be included in the word citizens in the Constitution. He went on to say that, quote, on the contrary, they were at the time considered to as a subordinate and inferior class of beings. End quote. Now, a lot of people who refer to this particular case always referred to that section in the decision where it says that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. They have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Okay. Now, this is where it needs to be noticed in Judge Cheneys' statement. He articulated that the argument applies to, quote, that class of persons only whose ancestors were Negroes of the African race. End quote. Okay. So, the key word in that phrase, Negroes of the African race, is the proposition of because if you say, the hood of the car, you're not referring to the whole car. If you say the trunk of the car, you are not referring to the whole car, you're referring to a section. So, the phrase Negroes of the African race is telling you that they did not see the Negro as being all of the African race, but a section of the African race. It's a classification that is backed up by the Negro Law of South Carolina in 1848, which gives you the definition of the word Negro as being the enslaved Africans. Not to be confused with the free inhabitants of Africa, such as the Moors and Egyptians, etc. So, let's take a look at what Justice Daniels stated in his concurring opinion. He's quoted as saying, "Now the following are truths which a knowledge of the history of the world and particularly of own country compels us to know, that the African Negro race never have been acknowledged as belonging to the family of nations, that as amongst them there never has been known or recognized by the inhabitants of other countries anything partaking of the character of nationality, civil or political polity. That this race has been by all the nations of Europe regarded as subjects of capture or purchase, as subjects of commerce or traffic, and that the introduction of that race into every section of this country was not as members of a civil or political society, but as property in the strictest sense of the term." They're telling you right there that this race is a construct, it was created. They are telling you it was the introduction of this race in every section of this country. First and foremost, there were already melanated people here before the European colonists came in, right, to quote the great poet Nasir Jones aka Nas. He said, "The problem is we started thinking like the colonists till Noble Drew Ali started dropping that consciousness." So, you have to think about that. So, they're letting you know that the Negro is a creation. It's a stamp. It's a mark. It was a term used to apply the property because the term Negro does not connect anyone to a land or a history. That's why the educational system always gives you Black history, which was originally Negro history. If you look it up, it started as Negro History Week, then it became Negro History Month, and then Black History Month. So, it only goes back to slavery. There's an existence of melanated people that existed before slavery, but the Negro doesn't have a history before slavery. Thus, the slaveholders created the terms Negro, Black, and Colored. Then came the term African American. These are all created concepts applied in terms applied to a people to take away their nationality from them. This is very important to grasp, very important to grasp. Think about it. Why did both justices make the distinction of Negroes of the African race? And what is its significance? Can Negroes be of other races? Were other races indigenous to Africa? Of course. Were there any other Africans other than the ones called Negroes? What other Africans were sovereign during the late 17th century? What inhabitants of Africa were considered sovereign? When you look at the history, you will see mention of the Moors. If you deal with the Moorish Empire and the Moorish history, there's a book that describes the two in detail. This is just to tell you that this is dealing with history. It's a book by two authors, Elizabeth Caldwell Hirschman and Donald N. Yates. It's called Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America. A Genealogical History. Here's an excerpt from the preface. It says, "We postulate that many of the initial colonists were of Sephardic Jewish and Muslim Moorish ancestry, usually arriving as crypto-Jews with their religious adherent disguised as crypto-Muslims. These immigrants served in prominent economic, political, financial, and social positions in all of the original colonies. Now, these were written by people of European descent. These were written by people who you would classify as white, not people who are classified as black. That's very interesting. You have to think about this for a moment. These authors are admitting to it, and the reason why this point is made is because when you look up the history of the Moors, you'll see that they were dark-skinned melanated people. So, it is no coincidence that there were many names used amongst them that incorporated with the indigenous people. There are Delaware Moors that exist. That's a Native American tribe here in this country. An indigenous people here in this country. So, the term Moor didn't just apply to people in the continent of Africa. We have to learn this history. It goes deep, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of time left to go into it because it would take more than an hour. It would take probably 5 hours to go into the records. If you get the chance, get this book called Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America. Also, get the book Othello's Children in the New World by Dr. Jose Pimienta Bay.